Relations between Americans and the Indians have not always been cordial. Even the Puritans faced some setbacks in their relations with the Native Americans. But during the 1600s, there was an Englishman, a Puritan, who had an exemplary relationship with the Indians. He came as a humble Christian servant leader. His work helped lead to the establishment of the longest-lasting, still in operation, Native American church in the United States. It's in Cape Cod. Dr. Paul Jehle, the director of the Plymouth Rock Foundation, comments on this extraordinary missionary to the Indians.
Many people today look at the relationship between colonists and the natives as all one-sided, which would mean that the colonists stole the land, did everything that was atrocious. And there were things that were done wrong. There's no question about that. But we leave out the other part of the story. There were individuals who truly came to do what was best for the natives, not trying to force them off their land or force them to become Christians. And the idea would be that when one looks at history, one needs to take all sides of the history and look at the totality of it. And I think that's what's critical for Christians to look at, because many Christians did it the right way. They were individuals who came and served. That's what we need to exonerate. Those are the stories we need to tell the next generation.
A great example of a servant leader missionary to the Indians was Richard Bourne, who lived in the 17th century. Bourne, Massachusetts was named in his honor.
Richard Bourne is a very unique missionary, set in the context of the fact that many people claimed they were Christians but came to dominate the natives and whatnot. Richard Bourne was very unique. Richard Bourne was a white missionary who came and ministered among the Mashpee natives as well as the Bournedale natives and in the 1600s. The interesting thing about that, he was the only white missionary that we know of that were actually adopted as the white sachem among the natives. The natives honored him, calling him the white sachem. Why did they do that? They did that because he served them. He did not want to dominate them. He wanted to raise up ministers in their churches after they got converted that were native, and therefore he was a service to them. He was a servant anyway. He did everything. He was a servant of highways, meaning that back in those days, the roads. He was a surveyor of roads. Bourne was very involved in serving them to the degree that he wanted to get their land rights codified forever for future generations.
Richard Bourne had quite an impact on the Native Americans in the Cape Cod area. A book by Edward Rowe Snow called A Pilgrim Returns to Cape Cod includes this quote about Bourne from antiquarian Amos Otis, quote, "Richard Bourne, by his unremitted labors for 17 years, made friends of a sufficient number of Indians, naturally hostile to the English, to turn the scales in Plymouth County," end quote.
And what ended up happening is they built a meeting house in Mashpee. It was finally completed in 1684, and he had just died in 1682, so his son, Shirjashib, was the one who continued that work. But that meeting house has been the oldest continually used meeting house among Native Americans in America that we know of. So the point is, this will have a great influence and a great long-lasting effect. And it just goes to show again that Jesus made those words, that if we truly are peacemakers, if we truly want the benefit of other people, then that fruit will be lasting.
This Indian meeting house is the longest lasting still operating church of Native Americans in the United States. It was the fruit of Richard Bourne's ministry in the 1600s. Then later in the 1800s, this church became a place of ministry for an Indian missionary to fellow Indians, and his name was Blind Joe Amos. He memorized the Bible by his mother reading it to him. One day there was an unusual incident that occurred, which, though hard to believe, it can still be found in several primary source documents.
They call it a legend today, but this was a story that was passed down from generation to generation. And the story was that Richard Bourne is walking the missionary trail, and all of a sudden on this large boulder, these Bournedale Indians, at the time natives, were making a sacrifice. And they often did animal sacrifices of some kind. In this case, evidently it was a human. And Richard Bourne he looked up to them and said, "Stop this act, or I'll call on God." And they just ignored him. He said, "Stop this act in the name of Jehovah." And again, they ignored him. And then it says that he looked up into the sky, a clear blue sky, and called to God and said, "God, would you intervene?" A bolt of lightning comes down, and here this boulder, this massive boulder, gets broken into 7 chambers. And this is amazing, evidently resulting in the conversion of many of these natives to Christianity. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this is not necessarily a demeaning thing to the natives, or neither does it exonerate Richard Bourne. What it does do is it shows the interaction. Consider this, that Richard Bourne would never have been able to do that unless he had a relationship with the natives. You don't just walk up to someone and do those kinds of things. Richard Bourne had that relationship. This happened in 1646, and he had already started a church there in Bournedale in 1637. So he has a relationship even with these natives. They know who he is. And I think this is the key lesson we need to learn today. These kinds of miracles or kinds of things that are written down in history. Some people can say, "Oh, that could never happen, this could never happen," but we have to recognize one of the most powerful statements that was made kind of summarizing this is the fact that if natives or anybody you tend to minister to trusts the messenger because of their character, they will listen to the message. And I think that's what we learned from Richard Bourne.
Today in our politically correct milieu, we rarely hear about any positive colonial European interactions with the Native Americans. And certainly there were many bad things that happened to the Indians because of the Europeans coming. But there were also some positive things too, such as Richard Bourne, as we've just seen. Such critics also seem to forget that even the first Thanksgiving in Plymouth, which was in 1621, was a wonderful example of people getting along despite their differences in cultures and backgrounds. The late Dr. Billy Falling said in one of our Foundation of American Liberty film series for Providence Forum, quote, "As a Native American, I thank God for the Europeans that brought us the gospel," end quote. For Providence Forum, I'm Dr. Jerry Newcombe.